much, Maya. And a warm, hearty evening here in southern Alberta. We've been enjoying beautiful weather. My name is Alan Donsky. I'm part of the team that helps to organize and present the speakers. And it's a pleasure this evening to do the moderation. Wellness Through Mindfulness was started in 2015 as a way of bringing to a much broader audience the practices, principles of mindfulness. And we've been very lucky so far to have a vast array of speakers with multiple perspectives. And this evening, Katie's no exception. There are two ways to get to our website. One is wtm.thebreathproject.org. The other is through a website called www.thebreathproject that supports wellness through mindfulness. I take this opportunity to also thank the CPL and particularly Patrick Mealy and Maya Milovic, who you've met, for really supporting us and giving us tremendous tech support and enabling us to do this. The recordings will be available. We offer Zoom presentations twice a month. You can find out the other details on the websites. And just to let you know what we do have coming up, and we meet on the first and third Thursday of every month. On the 4th of November, Thursday the 4th, we've got Phil Bluestein, who many of you are familiar with, a great colleague, friend of mine. And his talk is mindfulness. What is it and how to do it? And every now and again, we just go back to basics, and Phil is excellent at just reviewing the basics, something we often forget about, but we're doing that one. And then 2 weeks later, again, online through CPL, is Living Skillfully with COVID. And we have another wonderful presenter that evening, Anne Mahoney, who is a wonderful teacher and very experienced with mindfulness. This evening's speaker is someone who really has a unique perspective on life and mindfulness, Katie Turner. I've known Katie for about 6 years. We met at the university some years back. I've heard her speak publicly before, and you're really in for a treat. Katie is a registered psychologist, speaker, and intuitive guide, and takes a very holistic approach to healing. She's passionate about helping others overcome limiting beliefs, hence the topic tonight about self-sabotage, to create deeper and long-lasting transformation. Katie speaks on topics of psychology, spirituality, of creating change, and offers lots of workshops and groups to many, many different audiences. And her website is katieturner.ca. Again, just a reminder, please to type in any questions. There'll be lots of time for conversation, discussion, questions from 8 o'clock to 8:30. Katie has kindly agreed to stay on a few minutes if we're not finished, because we do want to make sure we answer everybody's questions and have conversation respectfully, but not more than a couple of minutes past 8:30, please. So Katie, I'm going to hand it over to you, and thank you very much once again for presenting to the group.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thanks for the introduction, Ellen. I'm just going to share my presentation here. And I'll turn off my video as I'm presenting, but I'll pop it back on at the end for questions. I'm excited to be here today to talk about overcoming self-sabotage. This is a topic I'm really passionate in talking about. A little bit about what I'll cover today. I'll give a quick kind of introduction to myself and my practice. I'm going to talk about the main causes of self-sabotage based on what we know about the brain and how our minds operate. As Maya said, I'll pause for questions kind of as we go, and then there'll also be some time for questions and answers at the end. It sounds like the recording will be going out or be available in about a month. And I do also have a free ebook that goes out on this topic that goes out with my newsletter sign up, and you can access that on my website as well. So a little bit about myself, as Ellen already introduced me. I'm a registered psychologist, and I work with clients all over Alberta. I also work with groups and corporations for presentations, workshops, and consulting. And some of my areas of specialty include things like anxiety, stress management, burnout, depression, trauma and PTSD, self-sabotage, relationship concerns, and couples and family counseling, boundaries and self-love and self-esteem. And I also work with transpersonal and spiritual concerns. A little bit about my story and background is I started off with getting a few degrees in psychology, and then I led to deeper study in Eastern healing methods and trauma processing techniques to work with deeper levels of the mind, more of the subconscious and unconscious. I found that with traditional psychology alone, there's a more of awareness of patterns and coping strategies, and there's more self-understanding, but oftentimes there's still repeating patterns that come up for people. And I found that to be the case for myself as well. With deeper levels of processing and techniques that get to more of the subconscious or unconscious mind and work with more of trauma processing, I found that this really led to more deeper, lasting transformation. And so, what is self sabotage? Self sabotage is really any behavior that creates problems and interferes with us achieving our longer term goals. It's really those times or situations where we're our own worst enemy. Some examples might be things like procrastinating on an important deadline or school project. We can often sabotage relationships, communication. Sometimes we might take on too much and not be able to do any of it well. We often see self-sabotage when it comes to health goals, whether it's exercising, eating differently. Anytime we're reacting instead of responding, there's so many different ways that self-sabotage can come up. It's really anytime we have a goal and there's something that's important to us, and we engage in a behavior that reduces our chance of success, or it might even blow it up altogether. And why do we do this anyways? To really understand self-sabotage, we need to understand the role of our brains, our fight or flight system, how our minds operate, and how our brains store negative emotional memory different than positive emotional memory. All of these factors can really work against us in achieving our goals. But the good news is that once we understand these levels, we have tools to work with them, and we can work with our brains and minds to achieve success. And I'll cover each of these areas in more detail as we go through tonight. One of the things that's important to know about our mind is really knowing more about how our minds operate. You may have heard of that iceberg analogy, where really with icebergs, the tip of the iceberg is really kind of the smallest amount that's over the surface, but the majority of the iceberg is actually below the surface. And this is a really good metaphor for how our minds work. Our conscious mind is like that tip of the iceberg. It's our thinking, rational, logical planning self. It sets goals and it knows what we want. It's where our short-term memory is stored, and its goal is really to understand. The problem with the conscious mind is it's really only running about 5 to 10% of the show. It's our present day and rational self. It's the one that's often aware of our patterns. It's the one that has read the books. It might attend workshops or go to therapy. When we have a goal, our conscious mind is usually the one on board with the goals we've set. So when we talk about self-sabotage, the problem's rarely with the conscious mind alone. Our subconscious mind, on the other hand, makes up about 80 to 90% of our mind. It's really our semi-automatic physiological systems. It's where we hold beliefs about ourselves and the world. It's our habits and our thoughts and emotions, our fight or flight response and remembered trauma. It's a long-term memory, and it's about protection, our fears and desires. It's really trying to protect us and to be right. Later in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about interpersonality parts or personality aspects. These are kind of parts of ourself that we all have, kind of different parts of ourself that can have different roles when we have a goal. And these often exist between our conscious mind as well as our subconscious or unconscious. And I'll cover these in more detail later, but just kind of to make note right now, it's usually they're kind of in between conscious and subconscious mind most of the time. Our unconscious mind is really kind of at the bottom of the iceberg there, and it's running at about 5 to 10% of the show. The hard part with the unconscious mind is we really don't have any verbal memory about it or any conscious story. It's our early impressions. So this is times from even in utero, birth, the first year, before our conscious verbal memory. It's automatic physiological systems, instinctual responses, any forgotten memory before we had that conscious memory. And it can even include cellular memory, like ancestral memory, and past epigenetic trauma. And its goal is really to survive. So if our subconscious or unconscious levels of the mind are not on board with a given goal, then our conscious mind ends up working against them. And if we look at the percentages here, this means that really 5 to 10% of our mind can be working against 80 to 95%. And so really with that uneven of a balance, who's going to win? When we're working with the conscious mind alone, it can take an enormous amount of effort and repetition, and it may not be enough. Oftentimes people can make limited progress to their goals, but then slide back to old patterns and not be able to maintain patterns in the long run. Good examples of this is like January at the gym. You might see a lot of people there for almost a few weeks, and then it's kind of back to baseline level. So the good and bad news is that not all approaches work at the same level of the mind, but once you understand the levels of a mind, then you can consciously choose tools that work at deeper levels. Until you make the subconscious conscious, it will control your life and you'll call it fate. And that's a quote by Carl Jung. So in terms of ways that we can heal each level of the mind or approaches that target each level of the mind, this slide is really just based on my areas of training and specialization. It's not meant to be a comprehensive list. There's lots of different tools out there and different trainings. But the important thing to take away here is that really not every approach is created equally or targets each level of the mind. Most of traditional therapy and psychology is mostly focused on the conscious mind. That's kind of traditional talk therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, when we're looking at like, what is the automatic thought? How do you feel when you believe that thought? Is there evidence for it? Is there another way of thinking about that? And how do you feel when you believe that thought? That's more cognitive behavior therapy. And that's really kind of the gold standard in a lot of programs. And that's used a lot in psychology. But the problem with a lot of conscious mind strategies is they really don't kind of reach that subconscious unless they're really repeated frequently over time. So subconscious mind is really like repetition of any kind of conscious mind therapy. But the important thing to know is that there are other techniques that can really get to more of the subconscious or unconscious. And most conscious mind therapies don't actually reach like the level of unconscious mind. And so sometimes if you're choosing to work with any new approach or therapy, it can be helpful to learn more about the level of mind that approach works at, especially if you have not had success with traditional conscious mind strategies alone. For clients, this can often present as feeling like you've hit a wall or gained as much or gone as far as you can with a certain approach or therapy. Without understanding the levels of the mind, people often feel like they can't get any more benefit from therapy or any other approach, but this is often not the case. It might be a sign that you benefit from a different approach or tools that work at a deeper level. So if you're struggling and feel stuck, don't give up. And before I move on to a little bit more about our brain, I just want to pause to see if there's any comments or questions.
Katie, we don't have any questions here in the program chat, sorry, I spoke too soon.
One question. Yeah, we just have a question. Yeah, Katie, can some therapies help with insomnia?
Yeah, there's lots that can help with insomnia. It kind of would depend on kind of where it's coming from, but insomnia can be a common problem because it can show up for a lot of different reasons. It's often related to like anxiety. It can be related to trauma, burnout, stress. I'd recommend kind of working with someone to narrow down like what the root is for the individual, because there can be lots of different causes, but it's definitely something that can be, it can be helpful to work with, especially after like physical causes are ruled out.
That's all for now, Katie. Thanks.
Thank you. So I really take an approach, a holistic approach within healing. There's a quote by, I'm not sure who the author is, but that we're not human beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a human experience. But as spiritual beings in a human experience, we do have a body and a brain that has been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. So we do need to understand how our brains work and how to work with our brains in order to create and maintain change. So some basic parts of the brain that are important to understand are our neocortex, which is really our thinking brain. This is the earliest evolved part of our brain. It's kind of the youngest part of our brain. Our right hemisphere holds intuition. It's creativity. It's where a lot of emotion comes in. Our left hemisphere is more about logical analysis, abstraction. Our prefrontal lobes are all about integrating information and processing information, whereas those earlier systems of our brain that have been around a lot longer evolutionary wise are our mammalian brain, our limbic system and emotions, and our reptilian brain, which is really our body brain and instincts, like keeping our heart rate beating, digestion working, all of those basic functions just to survive. It just does all of that without our awareness. But when we sense danger, whether it's real or imagined, our brain and body kick into high gear for survival. Our heart pounds faster, our muscles tighten, our blood pressure rises, our breath quickens, and our pupils dilate. Our senses become sharper. And these physical changes help increase strength, stamina, speed, and reaction time, really to help mobilize us for a threat or survival. But blood flow from the brain shifts away from the prefrontal cortex. So it shifts away from our thinking and logic and intuition centers to more of the limbic system and emotional brain. So we do need tools to work with calming the fight, flight, or freeze response in order to get more advanced thought processes, such as our logic and intuition, back online following an overwhelm. Some of the ways to calm the fight, flight, or freeze response is that when we are in fight or flight, you can often tell with that if you just take your heart rate, and usually about 100 beats a minute would signal that you're in fight or flight. We often can't think clearly, or we're overwhelmed in that state. We really need to kind of take a break during that time, and taking a break for at least 20 to 30 minutes. That's kind of the minimum time that it takes for our cortisol and adrenaline levels, our stress hormone levels, to really get back to more of a baseline, and for that frontal lobes on our right and left brain to come back online so we can actually kind of think more rationally again. When we're in fight or flight, that's oftentimes where we'll say or do things that we normally wouldn't do. Things like relaxation training, breathing approaches, meditation, or mindfulness are all very helpful in calming our fight, flight, or freeze response, switching our nervous system from that fight or flight to rest and digest. Another tool I really like is energy psychology techniques. It's something I use a lot personally and in my practice. I do have a resource section at the end of this presentation, so at the end I'll leave it on there, and there's some energy psychology resources there. It also kind of goes out with my newsletter sign up. I have a link that goes to some videos and free guidebooks and some good resources there. But energy psychology tools are techniques that really work at more of the subconscious and unconscious mind approach. They're also really good for trauma processing. And there's over 100 clinical studies with energy psychology approaches that show it's 3 times more effective than cognitive behavior therapy and taking medication for anxiety, depression, or past trauma. And they've done studies that show it significantly reduces stress hormone levels in even blood and saliva samples. Even just 10 or 15 minutes of tapping compared to talk therapy alone significantly reduces the stress response and calms the limbic brain. So it's a tool I really love. It's also really important just to have a healthy brain and body as a foundation. So anything we can do to take care of our body and brain, getting adequate exercise, nutrition, a healthy diet and supplements, avoiding toxins and getting enough sleep. Meaningful social connection is really healthy for our brain. And finding a way to engage in a sense of meaning or purpose can also be very helpful. I'll also talk here a little bit more about kind of the role and difference between our ego and soul in goal setting and self-sabotage. So when it comes to our goals, we do want to make sure our goals are coming from the right place and motivations. If we're chasing what we think we want without reflection of it aligns with our larger values and life goals, even if we achieve these goals, they often won't bring us satisfaction, peace, and happiness, or the emotional state that we're looking for. Some of these things can include things like chasing promotions or more money, or losing weight just for the sake of it, thinking it's going to bring us happiness or peace. And it often, most of the time, those things actually don't. To know ourselves, we can better reflect on how we want to feel and what's important about our goals, how we want to live, and the impact we want to have on the world. So understanding our ego is really our sense of self and personality. It has both positive and negative aspects. It can include our titles, our roles, our constructed self, and social masks. Negative ego traits often create separation between ourselves and others. It can live by shoulds and expectations or fears. And it also is important for us in setting boundaries, like knowing where we start, where someone else begins, what's ours and not ours. And these can be healthy or unhealthy. Our connection to the divine is really the spirit in each of us, and our soul is the observer in us where spirit and body meet. It's our true and authentic self. Our soul is connected to meaning and a sense of purpose. It's a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves. Our soul will inspire us to choose love and to act from a place of love and compassion over fear. Our goal is to move from acting from negative ego states to connecting with our soul and other positive ego aspects. It's really about having the ego serve the soul. And there's a quote by Albert Einstein that the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So again, we don't want to get rid of the ego. It's not really possible. We need the ego to exist in the world. We just don't want the ego running the show. And some of the ways that we can choose what helps over what hurts in the long run is with the ego. It may drive us and often drives us to act out of fear or to numb or suppress. Looking at addictions or numbing behaviors, fear, anxiety, resentment, getting caught in kind of a victim stance or a feeling of like us against them can all be signs of negative ego aspects. When we connect with our soul and that sense of something greater than us, it does inspire us to become the best version of ourselves. It's not really comparing us with others, but really more of like who we want to be in the world, to act in alignment with love. And it can often call us to go deeper into our own emotions, to get quiet, to go within for answers or guidance rather than comparing to shoulds or asking everyone else their opinion on what they think we should do. It can help us to surrender to control, to sort out what we can control and what we can't, to seek healing and soul lessons, like what is my soul wanting to learn in this situation? What can I take from this? How can I grow? How can I make meaning out of this situation? It also helps to connect us with our own intuitive guidance, which is like our own little compass that shows us our path in the world and what's going to make us the most happy and fulfilled. It's a sense of us and them, really a sense of we're all interconnected. Our soul keeps us connected to meaning and purpose, and it helps us focus on what we control and what we can control and to surrender what we can't. It helps connect us with who we want to be in the world and how we want to show up, even during difficult and challenging times. Some of the ways we can connect with the soul or the ways it speaks to us is often through intuition. And our intuitive languages come through our senses. So it comes through the same senses that we experience the world in, but it often has a different quality. It can be a sense of sight. That's often can be perceived or imagined as like people seeing things in the world, but sometimes it's just kind of an inner vision. It might be something getting your attention in your visual field and really standing out for you. For some people, it's just a knowing. It's just suddenly a knowing without really knowing why they know and not being able to explain it, but just kind of knowing. Sometimes people might have a bad feeling about something or just like really not trust someone and not really be able to explain why. And later they kind of get evidence that like some part of them knew. For some people, if they're more empathic ability is more an ability to sense energy in our own bodies. So empathic people feel the emotion. They might feel emotions from other people and feel it in their own body. They may also pick up physical sensations from others. That one's a little bit more confusing to work with. It was my dominant sense when I started out, and I specialize in working with empathic people as well. But it's really like our energy experience really changes depending on like what's going on around us. Like if someone we love is really not feeling well, we usually don't feel well either until we learn how to work with that. So we're not taking it on. It can also be auditory. Sometimes again, that can just be kind of our inner voice, like a small self-talk that just has a different quality to it. It might be overhearing a conversation or radio and it really standing out and just speaking to something that you really needed to hear. There's lots of different ways that intuition can show up. One of the other ways our soul can often speak to us is through little synchronicities. And those are those kind of like divine coincidences where it's like, that was weird. You might have been thinking about someone and someone mentioned them, and then suddenly they call and there's like an important opportunity or reconnection part. You might be wondering about how to solve a certain problem and you hear like 3 people mention the same book in a week. Those are important little things just to pay attention to and follow. And they're often little signs that we're kind of on the right path or there's something important there. For some people, get more intuitive information through their dreams, and there tends to be kind of a different quality to those dreams. Many people may report dreams of like dreaming about a pet or a loved one after they've passed, and just a sense that they're at peace or okay. Sometimes people may get premonition dreams, and they may get aspects of things that kind of like happen later. They might dream about someone that they know or love and reach out and find out that some of the emotional qualities actually similar. Sometimes there's things like signs and symbols. Some people might see like repeating numbers often or have certain symbols show up for them. It might be like an animal or something, but something that just keeps coming up and getting their attention, whether it's like a coin, a feather. It often has some kind of meaning. We don't always understand what it is. With following the energy and soul messages is really when we're kind of on a path of like, what's the right choice for us, we often kind of get a boost of energy when we're following that. So it's not always about kind of what we're doing or how much we have on our plate. If you've ever been in a job that you're just like so done with and you need to get out of, oftentimes it gets harder and harder to stay and you just feel like dread and it takes more and more energy and it just becomes very draining. But oftentimes when we start taking steps to kind of follow that next step, even if it's hard and even if it's work, we often kind of get a boost of motivation or energy because there's some level of like, okay, this is the next thing. This is exciting. It might be like signing up for a course or taking steps to like update your skills or look for a new job. The qualities of soul messages tend to be different. There's kind of a sense of like a difference with time or really kind of standing out and getting your attention. Some people might get goosebumps or some kind of symbol in their body and sense of like, this is something important here to pay attention to. But our society and culture is so based around logical mind and like rational thinking that we're really not taught like how to listen to intuition or soul or that it's even real. And there's a quote by Carolyn Myss that the soul always knows what to do to heal itself. The challenge is to quiet our mind. And that really is the challenge because we live in such a logical, mind-dominated society that we often need to make space where we can just relax. It might be walking in nature, like having times, for some people it's long baths, like really just that quiet time, whether it's meditation, where our mind isn't just so active that it allows for some of these messages to kind of come through, or it allows for us to have a deeper connection with these parts of ourselves. So before I move on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of those interpersonality aspects and like parts work about working with different levels of our mind. Before I move on, I'll just check in and see if there's any questions or comments so far.
I have a quick question, Katie. Can you just make a comment, and you mentioned it in the slide, how you sort of integrate the mindfulness, that awareness quality that really underlies getting in touch with all this? Just a word or two on mindfulness.
Yeah, well, I think mindfulness can be is a very helpful practice. And it's something I definitely would recommend because it is about that time of like, we really need to get out of like worrying about the past or future and just kind of getting in touch with present moment. The more present we are, the more we can kind of connect with these parts of ourselves and also calm the nervous system too, because we also can't connect with intuition when we're overwhelmed.
Thanks. Wait another moment or two. There's nothing showing up in the chat room. So probably we can move ahead, Katie. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to switch gears here a bit and talk a little bit about interpersonality aspects. And really, all of us have kind of different parts. It can sound weird to talk about it in this way, but it's not like a multiple personality thing. We all have different interpersonality aspects that really exist between kind of our conscious mind and our subconscious. with awareness and practice, we can start to recognize them, and we can bring more awareness and consciousness and bring that subconscious parts more into the conscious mind. So we have more tools to work with them. They often develop in response to our family of origin and early experiences. Some examples includes parts like we all have an inner critic, like the part of us that can be really hard on ourselves. It's often like you should, or that's not good enough. It's usually trying to drive us to do better or achieve. It's not often successful with that, because if it's too harsh, we actually do worse. We all have an inner child or different parts of inner child that can show up in different developmental ages. There's also more archetypal patterns that can show up of like an inner victim, an inner hero or healer, like a high achiever, perfectionist. But in times of stress, it's important to know that we all revert to earlier levels of functioning. And oftentimes when one or more of our inner personality aspects have a different goal or need, we really end up stuck in those patterns. That's where we end up self-sabotaging. When we're stuck in patterns of self-sabotage, our inner personality aspects are often working against one another. So when we can get them on the same page, this frees up energy to work towards our goals. So when it comes to goals, usually one part of us is focused on achieving a goal. This is usually our conscious mind, our present day adult self that can see the value in the goal, that actually like wants to do it. But the hard part is that meanwhile, like other parts of us might not be on board with that goal. And these parts often reside in the subconscious or unconscious mind. So again, that subconscious and unconscious, those parts are all about protecting us and our loved ones and keeping us safe. So there may be times when it wasn't safe or the risks were too high. There might be limiting beliefs about ourselves or the world or the likelihood of success that may have been adaptive at one time in our life or even before we can remember. Sometimes it's even in generations that we don't even have conscious memory of. That is really unhelpful now. But they can come up in terms of like resistance or sliding back into old patterns and just keeping the behavior the same. So when we can increase our conscious awareness of key players in any goal and those underlying motivations, we can help work with them so they can actually like come together to achieve goals in a way that works for our conscious as well as subconscious. Some examples of how inner parts can work is, again, like our logical, rational self can logically plan next steps and goal-related actions. Our inner child might need to feel safe and secure, though. It might need to have fun and experience, play, and joy. An example with logical and kind of inner child is like if our logical self wants to start setting boundaries and speaking up for ourselves, our adult self can feel really good about that and be ready and see all the benefit. If that wasn't modeled in our family, if we were punished for that, like our inner child might be actually very like afraid about that or not want to do that. So we often kind of end up in a tension, or it's like very, very difficult to try to set boundaries because those two parts can be at war there. Our inner critic might be motivated by a need to protect us and a drive to continue to improve and reach our goals. But we often need to really do some work with this part so it motivates us in helpful ways rather than sabotaging our success. Inner critic, we often have to work with kind of perfectionism and aim for good enough and like self-compassion over really harsh negative self-talk. Sometimes with sabotage too, we may also have a free spirit or fun side that if we're too focused on goals and it's all like career, academic, if it's all about pushing the needle forward and achieving, we might have a part that needs more fun and adventure or needs to balance work and caring for others with caring for ourselves. So when we can kind of meet the needs of all the parts and get them on board, then things flow a lot more smoothly. And one of the reasons I wanted to kind of cover this is that just so much of psychology and most conscious mind strategies really treat like any self-talk or thoughts like it's all the same or all equal, like it's just kind of one part of you. And in my own work, I so often see that like clients logically know that oftentimes automatic negative self-thoughts or beliefs are not rational or logical or true. And in my experience, both personally and professionally, conscious mind strategies alone often lead to greater awareness and understanding of old patterns and where they may come from, but that they often get stuck there. And sometimes that can be a downside because oftentimes people feel increased guilt or shame that they can't just move on or get over it because they already know it's not logical. Yet conscious mind strategies may not be enough alone. So in the past decade with this type of work, I think it can really help to normalize and validate that we all have different parts, and some of them are not logical in the present. So it's really normal and expected. And there's hope when we can understand this and when we have the right tools to work with these parts of ourselves, like when we have tools to work with kind of that subconscious or unconscious, when we can start to begin to understand that we all have different parts, and we can start getting curious about what parts might be coming up with a certain goal. And some kind of questions for reflection or practice is that if there are goals or areas of self-sabotage kind of standing out for you or in the future, just starting by bringing like a compassionate, non-judgmental awareness to what parts of yourself may be involved in the goal. And for this, mindfulness is fantastic here, because just sitting with it, just kind of bringing up that question, non-judgmental, compassionate, just observing, like, does the thought of bringing up that goal, like achieving that goal, does it bring up any uncomfortable emotions or sensations in your body? Are there any fears or resistance? Is there any memories that come up? Is there any beliefs or automatic self-talk? Just noticing these, making note of them without trying to change them, without fighting against them, without judging or shaming them, just noticing these for clues. And that can often help us figure out like what might be going on for this part. What are the fears? What is the emotions? What's the worst case scenario? What's this part worried about? And not censoring that with like, well, that doesn't make sense or that's not logical, because that's usually where our conscious mind is kind of jumping in. But those kind of fears can often lead to cues of like what might actually be going on that's really blocking success or the goal. I'm also going to talk a bit about trauma and overwhelm, just because that's another really important area. But I just want to pause again to see if there's any questions so far around kind of inner parts.
We do have a couple of questions, Katie. How can I quiet my mind when someone else is very upset?
If it's in the moment and someone's upset with you, like, I think it depends on the person and situation, but I'd usually say in intensity moments that taking a break is really important in all relationships. Like if we're really upset, we need to take a break. In relationships, that's part of almost like couples work a lot of time. If it's a couple situation, it's like that's one of the first things that often needs to happen with conflict with couples, is like, how do you take that signal to take a break ahead of time so that you can actually both take 20 to 30 minutes to calm down? Because when either person's in fight or flight, like it's not going to go well. And we do have this mirror neuron effect as like an emotional contagion, is that if we're starting to get overwhelmed and someone else is overwhelmed, it really tips us over very quickly. So sometimes it can just be, if there's certain situations where it keeps coming up, if it's someone with an intimate relationship where you can actually have a relationship and work with them, I would recommend people talk about how to signal taking a break before the moment and actually practice it, like rehearse it and practice it when you're calm, because it needs to be like a muscle memory. We don't do it in the moment when we're overwhelmed. If it's the first time we're doing it, usually one person leaves and another person is chasing or trying to finish the conversation. So if we can really practice it and have muscle memory and really be like, this is for the benefit of the relationship, that can usually help. I don't know the context of like what the relationship here is. So if it's like a work thing or if it's like a boss and it's different, it could be just coming up with some cues for yourself to be like, okay, I'm starting to get overwhelmed. Can you email this to me, or like, can we take a break and I'll come back to it? Just give me a few minutes. Can we follow up on this? Having just some quick sentence stems ready for those situations that you can kind of practice or rehearse ahead of time can help to like just give that break. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. There's a lot of tips in there. Thank you. Which inner personality leads to procrastination?
Yeah, again, it can be so many different ones. Like sometimes one of the most common culprits is like that perfectionist or inner critic. So I check if that's potentially one. But again, it's not always the only one. It really depends on kind of what the situation is, what's the context, and what's like the emotions, the belief systems, what's kind of coming up around procrastinating. It can be different for each person. So it's kind of just, it's often we kind of need to go deeper on an individual level to kind of tease those out.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so let's move on to a very important and common issue, the impact of trauma and overwhelm.
Yeah, so it's important to know with trauma, it's that we react to immediate and serious or chronic threats by really engaging that fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And this is really just automatic. Like, we don't have to decide it, it just happens. Our nervous system prioritizes offensive and defensive processes, and it shuts down those like more logical, intuitive ones. But it also disconnects some parts of the body and emotions and brain from one another. So what we see in kind of nature is that if a wild animal is like being chased, if they're in a fight or flight situation, once the threat is passed, they'll usually like shake it off and kind of recover and like go quickly from like fight, flight, freeze to back to like calm. And they do that very quickly as soon as the threat is done. But for humans, it's harder because like we have a harder time actually switching through our nervous system. Our logical mind kind of works against us here. Is so we often end up not being able to fully like process that through our nervous system. And we can end up with this like separation and imbalance that remains in us if we don't kind of process and assimilate those on more of a nervous system and brain level. So trauma is really the name that's given to both the overwhelm and the lingering after effects. And leading edge researchers now believe that most chronic emotional and physical illnesses have some root source in trauma. In my personal and professional experience, I really strongly believe, and I have witnessed so many times, that nervous system overwhelm plays a far greater role in mental health than I believe our current struggles, than I think our current mental health and medical system really acknowledge at this point. A metaphor for trauma is really like getting hit with a baseball bat. It leaves this sore spot when you've been whacked with a bat. And when the environment reminds us of the original trauma, it's almost like someone's coming in and poking that sore spot all over again. We feel the pain and emotions all over again from the original trauma. If we were poked in that spot without being hit in the first place, we really wouldn't have that strong of a reaction. So I'll explain more about the brain and how the brain stores negative emotional memory differently from positive emotional memory, and why this is so important when it comes to self-sabotage in the next slides here. So really in kind of normal everyday functioning, our right brain, that's where our right brain really is our kind of creative brain. It receives and records just a unified stream of perceived events. There's no really like conscious categorizing that happens with that. It's taking in kind of all of the emotions, all of the sensations, sensory information, and it's moving it through our hippocampus. Our hippocampus is really responsible for moving like implicit to explicit memory. So it really takes from our right brain all that sensory information, and it goes through the hippocampus to our left brain. Our left brain is really where our explicit memory is housed. It categorizes and creates stories. It's left brain is all like logic, meaning, rational. So it kind of takes like emotions and sensory information, and it puts it in kind of a logical linear story, like past, present. This, I was feeling sad that time. This happened then. It's not happening now. So that's all happening when we're calm, when our nervous system's regulated. The hard part with trauma is like once we go into a fight, flight, or freeze response, our body and nervous system mobilize to meet threats. So our right brain and creative brain is still receiving and recording this unified stream of consciousness and events. It's taking in all the sensory information. It's recording the emotions, but the hippocampus goes offline in fight or flight. So that emotional memory does not get transferred over to the left brain. So that left brain and explicit memory, those higher functions are less active, or they shut off completely, and our non-conscious reactions take over. Once we calm down again and that fight or flight has passed, we go back to kind of that regular processing. But the difference here now is that there is that old emotional memory that didn't get transferred is now still held in the right brain. It's holding that unprocessed raw emotion and feelings. But only present tense moments, once we're calm again, those are then getting moved over to explicit memory. But that past emotion has not been put into like a linear, logical oriented sequence. So basically what happens is like a similar event happens. With PTSD, there's like flashbacks and flooding. So with that raw information stored in the right brain, that emotional memory, it's like a similar event happens and suddenly that just floods right over. It passes right through our hippocampus. It goes into the left brain like it's happening right now. An example of this is like an environmental trigger can cause an emotional experience, and it's like the original trauma is happening all over again. The flashback is like we're right back in it. So an example is like a combat veteran might hear a car backfire, and they instantly feel like they're instantly are brought back to a war zone. They duck and cover, they forget where they are. It's completely flooded, and then they'll slowly recover and come back online. But there's no control over that. It happens in an instant. The thing that most of us aren't taught or aren't aware of is that we're not all going to have PTSD or we'll experience that in our lifetime or have flashbacks at that level. But there is like a lower level of trauma that one of my teachers, Dr. Michael Reddy, he coined the term blurbacks. And it's really more about when there is kind of that raw, like emotional memory that's there, but it's not as intense as like a PTSD flashback. So similar events come up and trigger that. And then it kind of comes over the present day emotions as well as past events also pass through the hippocampus and go into that left brain. So it's really this old emotional memory really kind of bleeds in to the present day experience. Some examples of that is like sometimes we might have a really big reaction to someone. One example might be someone having a trouble with a male boss and having a huge reaction to them because they trigger memories of their like alcoholic father who wasn't safe. So it's kind of like our anxiety, our stress response, fear-based emotions, they can be a lot higher in the present. But when it's happening, we're still connected to the present event. Like we don't realize it's coming from anything in the past. Oftentimes people will have a kind of hard time kind of sorting out, like they'll have some awareness and they'll feel like, I feel like I overreacted. Like my partner brought up this thing or asked this, and I know they mean well, and I just like blew up at them, or I just felt so anxious, or I just like freaked out. And so they'll kind of feel like, am I crazy, or did they do anything? And so it's really hard to sort it out in the present moment. But those are some examples of kind of how it shows up. The kind of good news is like with healing trauma, we often need like specific kind of trauma techniques. There's lots out there. The thing that most of them and pretty much all of them have in common is it's really about calming our nervous system. So keeping our nervous system out of fight or flight and online so that hippocampus still can transfer emotional memory from the right brain and put it into the left brain into a sense of a time linear oriented story. We want to keep the nervous system online to feel safe and controlled and really kind of bring up that old emotional memory in a safe way so that it then can get transferred and it's not just re-traumatizing. So with this, like when we're actually emotionally processing old emotional memory, it's kind of, it starts to get integrated of like, this was in the past, it's not happening now. It doesn't mean it's going to keep happening. We still have memories of the original events, but we can really like decrease or even eliminate the emotional intensity of related triggers. And some examples of like how trauma can show up or how we might know if trauma is going on in our life is feeling stuck or unable to help ourselves from repeating patterns. No matter what we do or try, when similar events or triggers come up, we can go right back into a previous pattern. And it's a reaction instead of responding. In the moment, there's little conscious control over the reaction. The emotional intensity is usually really high in that moment. Like if you rate it 0 to 10, with 10 being most intense, it's usually 7 to 10 when it's taking over. And it can exist at all levels of the mind, but it's often subconscious or unconscious. And it takes over like immediately. Like it can go from 0 to 60 within seconds. So there's like, it's like a knee-jerk reaction that we're not really in control of. And symptoms can intensify or often get worse with age or at certain times in our life. And this often seems really counterintuitive, and it really doesn't make sense or is frustrating for people when they're going through it. But unprocessed trauma often shows up later as symptoms later in life for individuals. And people often report feeling really frustrated with themselves or the situation. They might avoid similar events or triggers because this actually can work. Like if we're not exposed to a similar event or triggers, we don't have kind of the anxiety or the reaction. But the hard part is it does often require us to limit our life, and it may not work well in the long run. People almost often report kind of feeling like they're feeling stupid or not trying hard enough. like change is impossible or very, very difficult, and it can lead to a lot of feelings of hopelessness. Because as a society and culture, and even most of our mental health system, like we don't often understand trauma very well. There's a lot more education around like depression, anxiety, but there's not a lot of talk about like subconscious, unconscious, and how our brains store negative emotional memory differently. And so again, from my own personal work, and we're working with thousands of clients, I've really come to believe that we all experience these effects on some level. I don't think there's a single adult human alive who doesn't have some level of nervous system trauma, myself included. It doesn't mean it's debilitating or PTSD all the time, but it's like sometimes it can show up in how we react to things. Sometimes it's just an internal reaction or upset that we have that isn't really affecting anyone else, but it's causing stress for us. And they can often be very subtle, and we may not have any conscious awareness of like where these reactions are really coming from. So that's kind of the bad news, but the good news is that healing is possible. It's really about finding the right approach. And sometimes that includes finding the right support, especially if the trauma is very intense, if it's scary to work through on your own. It's not about forgetting the past. It's really about finding freedom from the past. Increases in intensity or distress or distressing memories can be viewed as a signal from the body and the soul that it's time to heal the past. These symptoms often show up when things are going relatively well. It's actually because we have the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual resources that we need to be ready to process the original trauma in a healing way. Difficult times can make us stronger and more resilient depending on how we face the challenges. One of my favorite quotes by Ananis Nin is that, "And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom." I think this quote really speaks to trauma because oftentimes people kind of come in or are ready to deal with it because it's so painful to live with it that it's actually like more energy in the long run to keep living with the effects than it is to do the work to kind of process and heal. I also just wanted to make a note on post-traumatic growth. The important thing to know about post-traumatic growth is that there is positive change that occurs as a result of exposure to adversity and challenge. 30 to 70% of individuals who face adversity often report positive growth coming out of the experience. It's not a direct result of trauma itself, but it's how people struggle and get through it. So it tends to occur in 5 general areas. It's a sense that new opportunities or possibilities have emerged from the challenge. It can be positive changes in relationships with others, increased connection or closeness. It's an increased sense of our own strength or resiliency. It can be a greater appreciation for life in general. It can also be deeper spiritual or religious growth or a change in belief systems. So some of the keys to healing and getting unstuck. Again, the key is to maintain a calm nervous system to allow for transfer across the hemispheres. If we're overwhelmed, if we're going into fight or flight, this is actually more re-traumatizing. It's not healing. So if that's happening, that's usually where I'd recommend people get support and have someone to help work through it who is skilled in trauma processing. We want to go at our own pace and feel in control of the process and learn tools and techniques to help calm the body and the brain and to process the related emotions while also discovering and strengthening internal and external resources. No one technique works for everyone. It's really about finding the right approach for each individual. And if working on your own is overwhelming, seeking professional support with someone with training and experience in trauma processing can be very valuable. With any therapy work, we really want, the research has really shown again and again that goodness of fit is most important. So finding someone who you feel comfortable with, sometimes that can take a bit of trial to find. But I think it's worth putting in that effort to find the right fit there. And also who has kind of training in trauma processing techniques specifically, because it is a specialty within psychology. It's something you kind of do like after. Not everyone who's registered as a psychologist actually has that training. There's a lot more like trauma informed, but not necessarily like trauma processing, which trauma processing is actually working with more of the nervous system and the brain to integrate those old memories. And so just to kind of quickly summarize is if you're feeling stuck in any area of your life, just to remember that change and healing are possible. Suffering is our soul's call for healing and integration, and symptoms can be viewed as a sign or a call to address what's not working and to choose what helps over what hurts, to live a more authentic life in alignment with your own unique purpose on this earth. If you're feeling stuck, you're not necessarily doing anything wrong. It might just be a need to change your approach in order to get different results and change your life. And I'll move on to questions. My contact information is in the slides here as well. You can also find me on social media. I kind of regularly post content and helpful pieces there. And I'll leave up the resources and I'll come back. I'll put my video on. So if there's any questions.
Thank you, Katie. I'm just reflecting on the depth and the breadth of what you've covered here tonight. And just for me, what I'm taking away, and others, of course, are going to take away different things, just that, and you spoke to it a couple of times in the last few slides, that in fact, our pain and our suffering, if with mindfulness, we sort of just start to pay more attention to those signals and not just meet every emotion with there's something wrong with me or pathologizing or why can't I shut down my mind or why am I getting anxious again? If we just lean into it, in fact, it's actually the doorway to the beginning of the healing, is to actually get in touch with those unconscious, subconscious. I learned a new term tonight, the blowbacks. It's a lovely term. And so really to see our suffering as a gateway to healing, because if we think about it, without the wound, there's actually nothing to heal. So in fact, the wounds present themselves, and with the soulful language, the gentle caring, and all of that being held in the spaciousness of mindfulness, I think that's the beginning of the path. And of course, with trauma, that can be overwhelming. And so you do need somebody to, perhaps walk you through this, because we don't always have the regulation techniques. So thank you again, Katie. And yes, we do have some questions. Regarding the flashbacks, and this person, they report, my daughter says she has PTSD from what a teacher said to her in grade 4. Is this PTSD or something else? Then there's a qualifier. She's an overthinker. And I think she's talking about her daughter, not the teacher.
Right. Yeah. I think PTSD is like a diagnostic criteria in the DSM too. So I think there is a challenge with especially generational pieces too. It's like there's kind of more and more awareness of diagnosis and things online on TikTok, Instagram. There's a lot of people speaking about things without a lot of context, and there's kind of more and more younger generation self-diagnosing kind of inappropriately. I can't say whether or not she has PTSD. I'd say that be for a professional to really assess, but it would really show up in almost every area of life. PTSD is it's withdrawing, nightmares, withdrawing from friends and family, loss of interest, inability to feel good emotions, so unless there's a significant change in her behavior since that incident, it's unlikely PTSD. And for it to actually be a PTSD diagnosis in the DSM, it has to be exposure to real or threatened death, or witnessing that to someone you love, or hearing a story like that. So it's actually pretty traumatic. Even if she met the symptoms, it actually wouldn't be diagnosed as PTSD just with a teacher saying something. But there could be a old emotional memory part. I've definitely worked with clients where they've been bullied by a teacher said something, and then they feel differently, or they're scared to speak up in class after that. They don't have PTSD, but there is old emotional memory there. So there is kind of the blur back.
Thanks, Katie. Would generalized anxiety come from past trauma?
It can. Usually, again, it can be a kind of different diagnosis as well. Generalized anxiety tends to kind of be across the board in every situation. Whereas if it's kind of more trauma related, there can be an overactive nervous system overall and more hypervigilance, but there's also a lot more reactivity around similar triggers. An example would be PTSD with a car accident. It's anxiety might be higher, but if you're driving and if you're in the same spot of the car, a similar intersection, then it's panic attack level, or a lot higher. But I think a lot of times the other part is that our current kind of diagnostic classification system, most experts in terms of trauma and childhood trauma are ongoing. It's almost like the death by 1,000 cuts trauma, where it's it's hard to really pinpoint. There wasn't major events or life-threatening things, but there's a series of things that happened, or adverse childhood experiences. Our current system doesn't do a good job of actually classifying that or diagnosing it, because there's PTSD, but a lot of experts in the field who especially work with ongoing childhood trauma, it's like none of this really captures it. So there's kind of more of a movement for like complex post-traumatic stress in that piece. And so sometimes there's a lot of things, trauma is one of the things that I see get misdiagnosed a lot, or like medical health system be like, oh, it's anxiety or depression or it's this, but it's like, it's actually not always the case. Like oftentimes there is more nervous system overwhelm that's actually contributing to it too.
Yeah, and I have an additional comment. I think the other side also goes, Katie, and as a psychiatrist, I think sometimes people can overdiagnose. You can call something whatever you want because everyone is on Dr. Google. And so I think a lot of people can overdiagnose and over-pathologize things, not to minimize the impact it's had, but we need to be really careful about what it is. And that's why really the kind of work that you're doing, and you mentioned it a few times, really teasing out what's actually going on, because there have been fads in psychology and healing and psychiatry for generations and hundreds of years, and fads come and go. And I'm not minimizing trauma in any way, but at the same time, we can make an error, oh, that everything's trauma, but in fact, we can also miss other things along the way. The next question, how do you maintain a calm nervous system? Can you give us some tips?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first one is like kind of like breathing practice is really good, like kind of 4 count inhale, 4 count exhale. Visualization can work for people too, like anything that's kind of relaxation training, that's really kind of working with like body and breath. Our breath is our fastest way to kind of override that fight or flight response and like force ourselves into kind of rest and digest. So it can be kind of grounding in present moment, like what's, 5 things you see, 4 things you can hear, something you can touch, 3 things you can touch, like really kind of bringing into present moment focus, focusing our brain, because again, our brain is like, it doesn't know the difference between kind of thinking about it versus actually happening in terms of that fight or flight activating. So we also want to switch our awareness to, if we are safe, like really grounding into feeling safe, whether that's the present moment. For some people, having a safe space can work well, like it's a place they might visualize where nothing bad's happening. It can have elements of real and imagination, but just imagining like what's with you there. It can be using like art or visuals to kind of make a picture, to kind of again ground in the senses of that space. Like, what do I see here? Is anyone with me? What's the temperature on my skin? It's safe, nothing bad's happening. A lot of like relaxation and kind of, and if there's old like trauma or emotional memory, there's kind of like grounding and containment strategies of like, how do we kind of put those memories away? Like the PTSD workbook has some good chapters in the beginning around like creating safety and like some of those practices. Again, there's no one thing that works for everyone. So sometimes we have to try a few things to find like what way helps me calm down.
Yeah. Phil, you have a question? Did you want to unmute your mic, Phil, or?
Great talk. Thanks so much, Katie. My question is, can you talk a bit more about Peter Levine's somatic experiencing? So what are the specific strategies one can use with body experience to deal with trauma?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with his work. I'm not trained like in depth in it. So it like some strategies, one of the tools I really like is energy psychology, like meridian system tapping. And it's kind of like EFT or tapping through peace, because it's shown to be 3 times more effective than just cognitive behavior strategies, specifically for trauma as well. So it's one that I really like. Somatic experiencing pieces, it's from what I understand of his work, it's really more about helping people kind of like move it through their body, or let the nervous system like do what it needs to do to kind of move it through. And so like other pieces can be like oftentimes like physical pieces. The Body Keeps the Score is one of the books I recommend in here too. And they talk about like synchronized movement, yoga, like bilateral stimulation. So a lot of times it is kind of like body movement based things. And sometimes people really benefit from like massage or body work too, to help kind of release things like craniosacral therapy in conjunction with like therapy or doing more of that trauma work. Writing can also be helpful with trauma, but in like short ways and kind of reauthoring the story. And again, keeping that nervous system online. There's a lot of kind of different approaches.
Yeah.
out there, but a lot of it is really about like a lot of this is stored like deeply in our brain and in our body and nervous system, not in our conscious mind.
Another question, Katie, and a number of the questions, there's a bit of a theme here. People are asking about very specific things, and I'd just like to, highlight that any particular technique or strategy, there's all kinds of, it's a matter of timing, it's a matter of practice, it's a matter of when, it's a matter of understanding all the different pieces. And so, with that sort of caveat, there's someone asking, I've done some training with tapping, but never remembered to do it. When's the best time to do tapping? And do you have tips on creating the habit of tapping?
Yeah, I think like anything, what we kind of know neurologically in general is, so kind of like general recommendations would be distributed frequent practice is best for our brain in terms of long-term change than massed practice. So that really means like, even if you're doing it 5 minutes a few times a week, that's better than like an hour once a week. So I think with oftentimes when I'm working with people kind of individually, I kind of look at like what's actually kind of manageable in creating a new habit and not having it be super overwhelming. Because sometimes people might be like, oh, I'm going to like exercise or meditate like an hour every day. And it's like, oh, let's just scale that back a little bit. And if you build up to that, great. But we want to start with like small, measurable, realistic, kind of time bound. We want to get that momentum and new habit going. So I'd often say tapping, especially when it is on more stressful things, like I'd usually recommend there's kind of time around that so that we have time to kind of put ourselves back together before going into something stressful. So sometimes we can use it in the moment. Other times it might be seeing like, do we have enough time, whether it's in morning or evening routine, that then we can do something kind of grounding after, so we can transition back to day to day. I usually wouldn't recommend working on distressing emotion stuff when you're like heading into a busy meeting at work when you need to be on. Because like sometimes it can bring up old emotion and make us pretty emotionally vulnerable. So we want to make sure just we have enough time and space to kind of transition from that and back to day-to-day life. Again, I'd say kind of setting it up kind of in your routines. Oftentimes, if we can kind of piggyback on existing routines, that really helps our conscious mind like get it and remember to do it. So for some people, they might have like a journaling practice or a mindfulness practice. And like, if we can kind of pair those together, it's often easier to remember to do it.
Thanks, Katie. I have a question on a slightly different topic. To sort of ego and soul. So how can someone determine when they're sort of working in the correct way to set some sort of a goal? Because the ego can be very gung-ho, I really want this, you've got all the rational reasons and all the rest. And how do I tease out when I'm sort of, when it's my soul work calling me versus my ego, and they can both be right at the same time, but sometimes the ego can take over a little bit and mess it up.
Yeah.
Can you speak a bit to that?
Definitely. I think like, again, they could definitely both be involved and often are. So I think like sometimes there's like deeper reflection questions around with the goal. It's like, what's important to me about this? What will I think if I achieve this, what will it bring? What's kind of the fantasy? Because if it's ego, sometimes it goes like, oh, I'll get the promotion or the job. And then like people will think I'm great and I'll be successful and I'll be valuable, or then I can relax. But if it's kind of a more of like, no, I just really want to do this. Like it's important for me to do this, like for my own growth. It's not really attached to outcome. It's just a calling. Like I feel like I have to, it's kind of part of my purpose. Other ways to kind of tease it out too is like sometimes there's kind of ambition and drive and things we need to do. But if it feels like it's like, I have to do this and there's zero room for myself in it, like there's no room for rest, there's no breaks, like I have to keep achieving, I have to keep doing more, I can't slow down. That can often be ego of like overachiever and like high, like perfectionism of like needing to kind of be the best and always be achieving at something. It can also show up as like ego can show up as like people pleasing too. So it might be seen like, is this goal really important for me? Or is this something I've just taken on? Like, is this something my parents have expected or society expects, or like I expected for myself at a young age? but do I really consciously want this? Like, have I really looked at like what this lifestyle will actually look like? Like, if I get the promotion and I am the boss, the hours and the expectations, like, do I actually want that, or do I want it for the status? Like, do I want it because I want to make a difference? It's important for me, or does it feel like it'll give me something of how other people see me?
Right.
Mhm.
Right. It's other people's agendas. It's not the true, authentic self that you spoke about, that sort of thing. Yeah. Have you got any comments, Katie? The last 20 months have been really a change, and a lot of people are feeling a sense of unsettledness, that kind of uncomfortable arousal. This is very uncomfortable. Have you any thoughts on how people can, separate what is just typical exhaustion from what we've all been through universally versus this might be something triggered related to my previous experience, or my soul is feeling hurt again, or whatever?
I'm not sure I fully just make sure I fully understand the question. I think because it is like we are living through kind of a collective trauma piece as well too. So I think there's like just just kind of elements around really being compassionate with ourselves, making sure we are having places where we can kind of calm our nervous system, boundaries around like how much we're exposing ourselves to like news and where we're getting that from, and how frequently we're kind of going down that rabbit hole, whether it's in social media, different news sources, internet. Like, we kind of need that balance of like informed, but not always like triggered and in this fight or flight. And it is such a strange time because I've never seen anything collectively where like so many people are so triggered constantly. So I think it's really that, like, what do you need to kind of take care of yourself? And it's hard to sort out because there is like real stuff happening, but then there's also like many times there is kind of layers with that too.
Yeah. Can you make a comment, Katie? Often people want to, and of course, have this sense of internal agency and being in control of their lives and internal locus of control. And I can do this, and we are smart species of being, and so forth. How do we sort of help the ego get out of the way a little bit? Because that can be a form of self-sabotage, this kind of do it all. Right. And I can have it all, and I do it all, and if I just try hard enough and I motivate myself enough and I do enough hours of meditation, etc., this real ego drive, and that can actually get in the way of actually the very thing that we need, which is to just lighten up a little bit. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so is that kind of more of like the like I think sometimes that perfectionism piece can kind of take the ego drive. It also, like, I think it is like we live in a very like capitalistic, consumer driven kind of culture, and like a lot of these messages like come from so far outside of us from such a young age of like do it on your own, like individualistic, keep working. Like, it's a very like unbalanced kind of masculine energy of like you must always push to achieve. So I think there's a lot of like untangling of that. And sometimes like even just small steps can be scheduling like rest or downtime that feels really hard to take. And we usually don't enjoy it, but taking it anyway and realizing the world doesn't fall apart, or that when we actually have that balance of like rest and productivity, we're actually more productive. Like, research has really shown that humans are kind of the only like natural living being that tries to go all the time. Like, nothing else in nature does that. We all have cycles. So I think there's that, like, some of it can just be giving permission to slow down, rest. Like, sometimes, like, even if you know you're like that, like setting limits around, like, even just, I've had to do this for myself because I'm definitely a recovering like perfectionist and overachiever is a tendency, but I'll have to give myself like deadlines of like, I'm not allowed to do any more trainings, or like I like really looking at what do you realistically have on your plate, and like how much energy and capacity does that take? Would you expect anyone else to do that much all the time, or would you be worried about them? And really kind of setting in some like structure and boundaries with it too, to be like, I'm not allowed to sign up for anything else, or if I do, something else needs to shift.
Yeah. So it comes back to permission and really being human at a deep level and listening to our soul, rather than the ego punishing the soul for wanting to rest. Yeah. We have another question, Katie, from a participant. Do you have any tips for when the thoughts surrounding the trauma keep resurfacing in spite of working on healing for so long?
I'm not like I would probably, that's one that it would be hard to, it's hard to speak to generally. I think I'd have to go, like, to give really good advice, it'd have to be kind of more tailored. Generally I'd say like it depends on kind of the thought parts. Like it could be some tips, again, like there's research around that people who kind of write about trauma seem to recover quicker. If I was kind of working on with it in my practice with people who are open to it, I'd probably do some tapping on the specific thoughts. Like, even though this part of me is having this thought, I want to find a way to forgive myself or to move on from it.
Mhm.
It can be kind of strengthening other parts of us, of like, what's the compassionate part of like, how would we speak to anyone else going through it? It may also be like sometimes, again, just going back, if it's overwhelming, like going into like safety and grounding and containment can be more helpful initially. And that I would say is foundation, like not going into it until you have that really strong ability to like turn it off if it's getting too intense and put it away and come back to like calm.
Right. And as you mentioned a few times, Katie, I think it's that not every kind of trauma therapy works, or technique or strategy for each person. So certainly, to think about, if you are doing everything you're doing and it's not working, maybe look at alternatives. Another great question regarding COVID-19. A lot of people have the fear around COVID that life will never be the same again. How can we deal with this? Can you give some tips on this? And as I read that question, I just had this sinking feeling of a sense of almost hopelessness or despondency, or we're fated to be in this desolation for a long time. I just felt this person's energy, even reading the question, Katie.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Yeah.
I think I don't know if I have the visual here. I do have it. There's some articles I put on my website that have like blog posts around COVID that do have the graph on it. But there is this piece of like actual like understanding phases of disaster recovery that can kind of be helpful too, of like initially when a disaster kind of first hits, we have this kind of like warning or preparation phase where it's like high mobility, getting ready. There's kind of the impact of it. And then there's kind of this like honeymoon phase where everybody's like, we're all in this together. Like, we're not alone. Motivation's high. There's a sense of like community cohesion, and there's a lot of energy and effort, and a lot of it's like pretty inefficient or wasted. But then we kind of hit this plateau, and then we start going into this like disillusionment phase where it's like, then we start realizing it's like, oh, like in honeymoon, it's like, we're going to get through this really quick. It's almost over. And disillusionment, we're like, oh, okay, no, it's not coming soon. This is taking a lot longer. Disillusionment is really where like collectively emotions kind of dip into like more of despair, hopelessness, this sense of like, we're never getting through this. Disaster recovery research is really based on, the last pandemic we had was 100 years ago. It's not based on pandemics. It's just based on like fires, floods, hurricanes. Like, it's based on like a single event that still takes time to rebuild. So we're also in kind of new territory where like, if I think since last Christmas as a culture, we've kind of been cycling through disillusionment and a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel back into disillusionment, like so many times with each wave, that it's like, you're not alone in feeling that. I think a lot of people are really there of that, this kind of like, oh, like, is it ever going to get better? Hopelessness, like despair. The kind of good news for disaster recovery piece is like disillusionment is the lowest kind of point. And it kind of peaks usually around like a year, 18 months or so after disaster. We're really in that now. But like after every disaster, there starts to become a recovery and rebuilding phase, which is then we're really, as a collective, we're mourning losses, we're grieving, we're working through the emotions, but we're rebuilding. And usually after disaster, when communities rebuild, they're never exactly the same, but the level of overall happiness and well-being does go back to where it was. And it can even kind of come like even higher than before the disaster hit. So in every disaster that happens, I think there's a piece of like collectively, we don't do symbolic death very well as like individuals or as like relationships or collectives. So I do think we're in this phase of like, oftentimes individually, like people may come to therapy or do some work when it's like their whole life is crumbling around them. And it's kind of that like crisis, like the root word is like danger and opportunity with it, where it's like sometimes foundations crumble, but then it's a chance to really rebuild. And like every time after symbolic death, there comes new birth. It's that piece of like difficult moments can really change us in ways that are really hard, but it can lead to a new part of us that's like even stronger, more aligned, more authentic to who we really are. And cultures go through this too, like societies go through it. We go through these periods of like a death or crumbling of old ways and a rebuilding, but we don't know what that new is going to look like yet because we're still in a lot of crumbling. So I think that those would be the pieces I would kind of say of like there is always hope kind of after, like there is hope after. We don't always see where it's coming, but it's kind of that like caterpillar cocoon to butterfly piece of like we can't totally predict it, but we got to do what we can to take care of ourselves, like move through the emotions. It doesn't say like the suffering's very real, there's real compassion for what's going on, but it's kind of holding on to that hope of like after every disillusionment, like rebuilding eventually comes.
And that concept of hope, as I'm hearing, and I remember reading somewhere talking about hope as an orientation of the heart. It's not hanging on to some expectation I've got no control over. That's often a setup for disappointment because we don't have control over what that is. I'm also going to sneak in here mindfulness, back to the question, the concern here that life will never be the same. Through a mindfulness lens, every single moment of our lives is fresh and new. We've never had this moment before. We've never had this time before. You've never had this exact circumstance in your life. So to Katie's point about birth, life, death, renewal, mindfulness actually teaches us that nothing is actually permanent. Not this breath, not this moment, not October 21, 2021. That in fact, if we take that broader perspective, we shouldn't want things to be the same again. But back to Katie's point through the mindfulness lens about that fight or flight or freeze, because the future is always unknown. And you can comment on this, Katie, we always have some degree of worry or fear or arousal about the unknown. We're not sure when the next saber-toothed tiger is coming. And so just that broader soul perspective that, no, it's not going to be the same, and it never has been. So we're constantly evolving. Anyway, I don't know if there's a question in there or you want to comment on that, Katie.
One piece I just kind of want to add to is like, I think like, which I've been doing in some other presentations around just kind of like mental health around COVID and burnout, is that I think there's so many pieces of like, there's so much change and uncertainty, and that's a lot of mental energy to adjust to. That's really tough on our nervous systems. And a lot of times, a lot of the hopelessness can come out with like all these things that we really can't control, like other people, the world, politics, policies. Like we can do sustainable things of like use our voices in ways of like, what can I do to kind of be the change I want to see? But we don't want to get so tied in it that like we're just exhausting ourselves or like going into despair and hopelessness. So I think there's this like reorientation of like almost like meaning or purposeness. And it's not so much of like, what do I need to change around me? But that focus of like, who do I want to be in this? How do I want to show up? Even if that's just with like my loved ones, the cashier at the grocery store, my coworkers, like, how do I be the person I want to be? And I often kind of come back to one of Viktor Frankl's quotes in Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote that book about after surviving the concentration camps. It's like horrific conditions, but he really observed like who was more likely to survive in that. And he talks about like the last of man's freedoms is the ability to choose their response in any set of circumstances, like how harsh the world can be, but we always have the freedom to choose like who we are and how we respond and show up. And I just think it's so powerful because it's like that's living through something like that's so horrific, and that like some of the biggest human tragedies. And just he saw that people who like connected to meaning, like their loved ones, like shared a piece of bread with another prisoner, like they stay connected to meaning and we're more likely to survive. So sometimes there's this piece of like, how can we create meaning and stay connected to our values and meaning, even when we can't control the outside circumstances? And that can be a beacon of hope.
Wow. Wow, Katie, just such richness and depth. There's so much here. And I think if people are leaving with a sense of, wow, there's a lot to deal with here, there's a lot on offer. There's a great buffet that Katie has put before us. And again, as Katie mentioned, it's a very individual journey. And I'm keeping an eye on the time, and there aren't any other questions. That if you could perhaps, Katie, just show us your summary slide again, or make a couple of final comments.
Sure. Sorry, I just have to.
Yeah, it's
Go
up on
back
the
to
screen
where-
still. So yeah,
There
it's great. If you didn't have the slides up, I wouldn't have you do that. But
you go.
bringing back the visuals can be very helpful.
Katie, we can't see your slide up.
Oh, it's not showing yet? Okay.
Oh, I can see it. That's
Oh, you can?
Oh,
Okay.
okay, there we go. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
that's fine. Can you comment, Katie? Do you want to give us just a, something we can carry away in our heart or our soul as we wrap up this wonderful presentation?
I'm not sure. Just thanks for having me here, and I hope there's something, like I'd say, for each person to reflect on, like one takeaway for themselves, or like what stood out.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katie. A reminder for those who've been asking, a reminder that the session has been recorded. It will be edited later on by the folks at CPL. It will be up on the website in a month or two. I'm sorry, in about a month. Thanks again to Katie just for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And I think you've taken us into some very important territory that, as you said, has been neglected in our culture. And of course, mindfulness is that capacity to, just come back to the moment in the service of needing whatever needs to be done right now. So whether it's quieting that mind, whether it's the arousal, whether it's actually deciding, can I do this on my own? I've been trying, maybe I need other help. Who are my safe people? Who are the people I can talk to? Who are my safe people? And really, it's all about self-care ultimately. And that is one of the languages of the soul, is really to look after itself, because the soul really is just looking for what I call peace, beauty, and joy all the time. So thank you very much, Katie. Once again, just reminding folks that on the W2M websites, there are previous talks. People can watch them. Thanking again to the Calgary Public Library. And just to make a note, we used to meet in person till COVID outbreak. We are a group of people who give freely of our time. None of the speakers are paid, and we really do appreciate it. We do, as a group, WTM does have some ongoing expenses, posting the websites, paying the site administrators, etc. So please feel free, if you are so moved, to make a small donation. It can be as little as a couple of dollars just on the website to support our work as a token of appreciation for those expenses that we do have. We are always asking ourselves, as the the leadership team, as it were, when can we get back to meeting in person? We're not quite there yet, but certainly things are looking up. And as Katie said, from the death comes resurrection and rebirth, and we can all get excited and look forward to that. Thank you very much for your participation. There was a very lovely, strong turnout this evening. Great participation. Thank you for your open-hearted questions, everyone. And again, thank you to Katie and to Maya for your support services, and you too, Phil. Thanks very much.